Hello, everyone. I'm going to discuss a book today by Taylor Branch called The King Years, Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement. Now, this book was published in 2013, but in fact, it is based on a trilogy by the same author. And what he has done in this particular book is he has taken some 2,000 pages of the trilogy. The trilogy is comprised, of course, obviously of 3 books. The first of these being a book called Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 63. The second is Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years, 1963 to 65. And the third one takes up the King years from 1965 until his assassination in 1968. These 3 books were published earlier than 2013. So what Taylor Branch has done is he has taken what he considers to be some of the pivotal moments in the civil rights movements, beginning with the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1956 and closing with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. For those who are not familiar with the civil rights movement or are familiar only with such things as King's speech in 1963 in Washington, D.C., at what is called the Great March or the March on Washington for Jobs, where, of course, he delivered his very famous oration on I Have a Dream. If people are familiar only with incidents of that kind, and perhaps with something like, let's say, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the book may be not that instructive for them or that illuminating, but I would suggest nevertheless, that in the manner in which Taylor Branch has condensed his very rich and detailed anthology, which is really a work for scholars, because I suspect that very few people will actually want to read the 2,000 pages of the trilogy. For those people, this book may still have some particular merit, because what Taylor Branch is able to do in this short work of 200 pages is to not only highlight some of the key moments in the civil rights movement, but to suggest the trajectory of King himself and of the civil rights movement, which in some respects people are not familiar with. They're not familiar with, for example, the war on poverty, or what is it that led King to actually embrace the cause of anti-war activists once the United States had, particularly under Lyndon B. Johnson, decided that it was going to now initiate a full-fledged war against the communists in Vietnam. Right? So how King and how the civil rights movement came to that moment, and what were the tensions in the civil rights movement as a consequence of that. Now, those are the kinds of things that I think that even many people who are familiar with, for example, the March on Washington in 1963, or perhaps with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, even if they're familiar with those kinds of incidents, they may not actually be familiar with the larger contours of the struggle. And so I think the book is particularly useful for that. Now, the book is divided in 18 chapters. It begins with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And, of course, in the 18th chapter is what he calls Requiem in Memphis, because it was in Memphis at the Hotel Lorraine that Martin Luther King was assassinated in April of 1968. Let me take about 15 minutes or so. This is not a work that is very dense intellectually, but there are some extraordinary moments that he highlights, and there are some interesting twists and turns in the whole story. For example, the very complicated positions that Martin Luther King and LBJ, that is Lyndon B. Johnson, had to adopt vis-a-vis each other, because both of them needed each other, and yet both of them, of course, felt a certain kind of tension with the other. So these are the kinds of things, I think, where Taylor Branch is really, I would say, at his best. But he does begin, of course, with the Montgomery Bus Boycott, because this was the occasion when this unknown preacher, Martin Luther King, was really plucked out of the wilderness, so to speak, and when it was decided that in Montgomery, they established Montgomery, Alabama, they established an association called the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was going to lead the effort to boycott the buses, because the buses were, of course, segregated, and they plucked this preacher out of obscurity to lead the movement. And the rest, as they say, to rehearse the cliche, is history. But what is very interesting is that you can see that soaring rhetoric, which really characterizes the public addresses of Martin Luther King. You can see that in his very first address. And one of the things that lent majesty to his orations, his public addresses, was, of course, the fact that he drew upon biblical phrases as well. And one of those biblical phrases that Taylor Branch points out, and you see that repeatedly in many of King's addresses, is from the Old Testament, from Amos 5:24, until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Right, that the struggle will go on until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. So I wasn't aware of the fact that King had used this expression from Amos 5:24 from the Old Testament in his very first major public address. Chapter 2 takes us to SNCC, that is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Sit-ins in 1960. And this chapter highlights the role of James Lawson, who is 93 years old and lives in Los Angeles. And I'm actually finishing up a book on him, which I hope to be able to share with people who are viewing this video, I hope a year from now, because I've had 14 extensive conversations with him running to about 27 to 28 hours in length. The last of the really great architects of the civil rights movement who's still in our midst. And at 93, Reverend James Lawson is still a very active person, an extraordinarily remarkable man. But going back to 1960, it is in Nashville, Tennessee, as Taylor Branch points out, and as is well known to people who, of course, are familiar with the contours of the civil rights movement in some detail, that this is where, in Nashville in 1960, that James Lawson initiated a workshop in late 1950s, and then moving into 1960, initiated a workshop in nonviolence. And this is one of the most legendary institutional practices of nonviolent training that can be seen anywhere in the world. It is partly in consequence of Lawson's thinking that Martin Luther King adopted finally the policy that had been used, of course, in India itself, and that was the policy of filling up the jails. So there is, in fact, actually an entire book on that, which I will be taking up shortly, called Ain't Scared of Your Jail: Arrest, Imprisonment, and the Civil Rights Movement. And this book is entirely on the subject of how people in the civil rights movement after the initiative of James Lawson, struck on the idea of jail, no bail. That is to say that this would become one of the fundamental tactics of the civil rights movement, was to fill up the jails. And in some other works, there is very extensive discussion of how, including the work that I've just pointed to, a very extensive discussion of how the segregationists and people who belong to the KKK, the people who belong to the police establishment, and of course the police establishment in the entire Deep South was deeply complicit, of course, with the KKK, with the White Citizens Councils, and with other segregationists, right? So how they attempted to actually try to negate this strategy, this is a very interesting question that I will take up when I take up that other book. But in any case, in this second chapter, one of the things that Taylor Branch points out very early on, and this is going to become a very interesting point of, I don't know if contention is the word, but it would become a point of unease, a point of some anxiety. A point that people would repeatedly bring up is, why isn't it the case that King himself did not take part, for example, in what are called the sit-ins? The sit-ins were the movement initiated by people such as Lawson in Nashville. There had been earlier sit-ins in places like Greensboro and the Carolinas, but it is really the Nashville sit-ins that really, in a fundamental sense, made the whole attempt at desegregation a fundamental plank of the civil rights movement. And this would then manifest itself in various ways. And there were various occasions on which King was asked if he would actually take part at these demonstrations to try to desegregate these lunch counters. He never did, much in the way in which during the freedom rides, which is the occasion for chapters, some subsequent chapters in Taylor Branch's work, during the freedom rides, Martin Luther King himself actually never really took part in any of the freedom rides. He was an advisor. He was, of course, one of the theorists, one of the strategists in some ways, much less so in the case of the freedom rides than in some other aspects of the civil rights movement. But apparently this question really comes up as early as the sit-ins in Nashville, led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Jim Lawson. But what I think is most interesting about this particular chapter, and there's a much more detailed discussion, obviously, in the trilogy, what is most interesting here is the manner in which Branch suggests that Lawson and King, in a manner of speaking, found each other. That is, that they both emphasized the idea of love, that one must conquer through love. Both of them were critical, particularly Lawson, of the NAACP, which they saw as an organization that really was timid and was really an organization of the black bourgeoisie and did not speak to the interests of most working class black people. But what he says on page 21 is that Lawson and King inspired confidence in nonviolence in a manner that had never been witnessed before in the United States. And so this meeting between Lawson and King was a crucial story in the civil rights movement. Chapters 3 and 4 are about the freedom rides, the first phase of it. So there's an earlier history of freedom rides, which I'm not going to get into right now, which is in 1947. Taylor Branch doesn't really speak about it because recall that the trilogy itself is America in the King years. And 1947, you had a freedom ride which was led by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Bayard Rustin, one of the other great architects of the civil rights movement, was a key person in that phase of what you might call the prehistory of the civil rights movement. But the freedom rides, as they're really known to most Americans, to the extent that they're known to most Americans, that history is a history that goes back to 1961. The first phase of it was a freedom that, so again, for those who are not familiar with the freedom rides, so this was an attempt by people who were very carefully chosen. Some of them were volunteers, and some of them were people who, of course, had been trained by Jim Lawson, others who were members of CORE, that is a Congress on Racial Equality, another major organization that spearheaded the civil rights movement. So you've got SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you've got CORE, and of course there is the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was led by Martin Luther King. There's some other organizations as well, but we don't need to get into that history of organizations at the moment. The important thing here is that these freedom rides were undertaken in an attempt to desegregate interstate transportation. Now, of course, there were Supreme Court rulings, the 1954 ruling in particular, Brown versus Board of Education, which should have made all of this unnecessary. But the fact of the matter is that Brown versus Board of Education, as has been pointed out repeatedly by many historians of the civil rights movement, barely made a dent in much of the Deep South, especially, where resistance to integration or desegregation, the two are not exactly the same. We leave that aside again for the moment, but resistance to that was ferocious, right? And so therefore something like the freedom rides became important. And in another book that has been written, which is a huge study of the freedom rides, which I'm going to discuss later on at some point, I will discuss in greater detail the nature of these freedom rides. But what Taylor Branch does in chapters 3 and 4 is to discuss very briefly and in really quite, I would say, energetic prose, because each of these chapters is really about, something like 6, 7, 8 pages on the whole. And just so that people understand the structure of the book, so each of these 18 chapters has a kind of a short introduction of between 1 to 3 pages, and then the rest of the chapter is really excerpts from the trilogy, right, which are relevant to that particular chapter or that moment that he is seeking to describe. And so what he describes there is what happens when these buses, when the freedom riders went on these buses. So when they arrive, the bus station is empty, eerily empty, and when they get off the bus, a mob of white people will descend upon them, beat them up, spit on them. And some of them were savagely attacked with rods, pipes, bats. Right? So this is what he describes in chapters 3 and 4. And some of the characters who appear are, of course, not only the very famous freedom riders, including John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis. He became a congressman later on. At that time, he was, of course, a very young man. And as I'm sure that some viewers are aware, Congressman Lewis passed away a year ago. And in fact, it was Reverend James Lawson who was one of the 3 or 4 people who delivered a eulogy at his public state funeral, right? But it's not only the freedom riders who are the characters in these chapters. It's people like Bull Connor, the really malicious segregationist who was the sheriff. in Birmingham, and the governor of Alabama, Governor Patterson, right? And I don't have the time here to discuss their roles in this and the particular way in which they connived at some of this violence, even when they were sworn to uphold the law, right? But again, he has a little bit, as I've hinted before, Taylor Branch has a little bit discussion about the unease among some of the freedom riders because Martin Luther King was not among those who volunteered for this task. Of course, some took the view that King was already too big to do this, but I think the view of Jim Lawson is, I think, the most interesting, that if King was coerced into doing this, this would itself be a form of nonviolence, and that King had his own reasons for not actually going on the freedom rides himself. That we should not construe this as some sign of cowardice or weakness on his part, right? But I would be doing the author injustice if I did not point to some of the passages. I want to just quote one or two passages every now and then to indicate why this book really is quite delightful reading, even for those who are really familiar with large parts of the story. So, for example, when the Freedom Riders arrive in Jackson, then this is in Mississippi. So this is when they go from Montgomery to Jackson, Mississippi. They're going to be arrested, and they're going to be taken to this notorious jail, Parchman Penitentiary, and they're going to be given these ill-fitting clothes. But let me quote here from pages 38 to 39. So the prisoners were left waiting there for what seemed like an eternity before being marched to shower rooms, where they bathed under the gaze of shotguns. So this is in Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi. More than one of them felt stabbing rushes of identification with the prisoners of the Nazi concentration camps. Then they went on another naked march along cement corridors to the maximum security wing, where, locked to a cell, they endured another long wait before the guards brought their only prison clothes, a T-shirt and a pair of pea green boxer shorts. Left alone at last, they shouted out their relief in complaints about the skimpy, ill-fitting garments. "What's all this hang-up about clothes?" James Bevel cried out above the noise. Gandhi wrapped a rag around his balls and brought the whole British Empire to its knees. End quote. And for those who don't know, James Bevel was, of course, one of the protégés of Jim Lawson, one of the people who attended his nonviolent training workshops for many months in Nashville, one of the most colorful characters in the civil rights movement, and unknown really to most people, the person who is the author of most of the signal initiatives, the most significant initiatives and tactical gestures of brilliance in the civil rights movement, right? Including, for example, the march from Selma to Montgomery, which itself is one of the subject of one of the chapters of Taylor Branch's book. Or, for example, the deployment, if one wants to call it that, of children in the struggle, right? So initiating the children into nonviolence in Birmingham, right? And making this into a children's movement as well. Well, this again was a thought bequeathed to King by Bevel, right? So there are many things that Bevel is really quite responsible for, and of course he is not as well known as Martin Luther King or James Farmer or Andrew Young or Bayard Rustin or John Lewis, but Bevel was unquestionably one of the principal figures in the civil rights movement. Right? Chapter 5, it's going to be impossible, of course, to describe all the chapters here, but chapter 5 is about Bob Moses, who is very important, particularly because of his efforts to try to bring a certain kind of pedagogy of the struggle into Mississippi, into the Deep South. Eventually, he's going to leave for Africa. He's going to disappear for, so to speak, for some time. He's going to return and he's going to start teaching mathematics. And there are, of course, predictable moments in the book. So chapter 7 is on the March on Washington. Chapter 8 is on the Birmingham church bombings, where a bomb that had been set up by white racists, by white supremacists, exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church and killed 4 very young black girls. I mean, we're talking about children who were really 4, 5, 6 years old, something of that kind. Freedom Summer 1964 is the subject of chapter 9. This has been shown in a number of feature films, films such as Mississippi Burning, and this has to do largely with the disappearance of 3 civil rights activists, 2 of whom were white, 1 black person. James Chaney was a black man. Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner were the 2 white men, and these 3 men disappear, again, victims of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan and white segregationists. And they had actually gone to investigate a church bombing, not the one in Birmingham, but another one, a church that had burned down. But there were also people who were involved, as many people were in the movement, in voter registration drives. And all of this really, I mean, in reading this book and reading many other books about the civil rights movement in recent weeks, one of the things I've been struck by is the uncanny resemblance in many ways to the attempts by Republicans. And it must be said, of course, that the majority of the Republicans involved in these initiatives today are white Republicans. But it's an uncanny resemblance to their attempt in over 20 states, attempts that have been unfortunately very successful, attempts to make voting difficult for ordinary people. And that means in particular working class people. Large portions of the black and Hispanic populations are working class people, right? And so there is an uncanny resemblance, if one thinks about it, in the attempts to try to curtail the rights of voters today to what was happening 6 decades ago. And of course, it's not only an uncanny resemblance, it is absolutely shameful that something like this is happening in the United States today. Chapter 11 is on MLK, Martin Luther King, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Nobel Prize for Peace that Martin Luther King won. We know, of course, that the FBI, under the instructions of Hoover, had been wiretapping King. Many thought that he was something like a communist, and of course they tried to disgrace him. So this chapter is partly about that, but it is also really about the Kennedys. This is something that continues in some other portions of the following chapter as well, but it's also about the Kennedys, because one of the things that Taylor Branch is trying to point out was that though Kennedy, particularly JFK, John F. Kennedy, was not really someone who came into the presidency as a sympathizer of the civil rights movement. I mean, he was sitting on the fence, that to the extent that he thought that it might politically benefit him, he was willing to assist the movement. But if he thought that it was going to handicap him, then he didn't really have any commitment to it. And one of the things that Taylor Branch points out, certainly not the first person to do so, however, is that King is slowly, JFK is slowly drawn into the movement, partly because of the kinds of obscenities with which the FBI and Hoover and people like them were associated with. And when I say obscenities here, I don't mean it in the literal sense of the term. I'm not referring here to sexual obscenities. I'm referring, of course, to the fact that these were people who worked, people like Hoover and the white segregationists, people who were really beyond the pale in many ways. People who cannot really be viewed in some sense as civilized. But here again, there are these interesting tidbits because there was pressure later on, this is now after the death of Kennedy, on Johnson, that by among some people to say that, well, you should let Hoover go because he's really a handicap. I mean, the man is a lunatic. But LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, wouldn't do that. And as he famously put it, when I say famously here, perhaps I should not use that word because I'm not sure that many people are familiar with what Johnson actually said, but these are his exact words when he decided that he was going to retain Hoover. Quote, "I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out rather than outside pissing in." Right? So these were certainly people who had a sense of humor. Chapter 12 takes us to the march from Selma to Montgomery. It's not one march, of course, as some people might be aware, because there was first a march on March 7th where John Lewis and many others were badly beaten up. And then there is the march on March 9th, where there is a kind of a standoff. The troops decide that they're going to pull back. And then, quite unexpectedly, Martin Luther King himself decided to pull back. But as Taylor Branch points out, one of the reasons for that was that there was an injunction which prevented King from actually, and the civil rights activists, from undertaking the march. And the matter was still before the court. And so, of course, we have to understand the whole question of the relationship of civil rights activists to the law, because in principle, the best way to understand it is to come to the awareness, and this goes back to people like Henry David Thoreau and, of course, Mohandas Gandhi, that even when you are breaking the law, you must have a respect for it. That is, that a particular law may be broken because it is unjust, but one must still respect the spirit of the law, right? And here, because at this point the matter was still before the court, King is going to pull back, and and then eventually there's going to be some days later, when the injunction is lifted, that there's going to be a march on this bridge, the Pettus Bridge, as it's called, from Selma to Montgomery, right? Chapter 13 looks at the whole question of Vietnam, because Martin Luther King decided in 1965 that he was going to speak out against the war in Vietnam. And this put both LBJ and King in a difficult position, as Branch and other historians have pointed out, because LBJ was counting on King not to really say anything about the war in Vietnam. King was, of course, counting on LBJ's support, which he did get when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed in 1964 and 1965. And of course, Lyndon B. Johnson expected that King would, having received these gifts, as it were, certainly I think Lyndon B. Johnson thought of them as in that way, he thought that he was therefore then entitled to King's support on the war. But this is not the view that King would have. And this is a question that comes up again in chapter 17. Meanwhile, what is interesting, and I think the later chapters in that respect are certainly more interesting, because we think again, ordinarily most people think of the civil rights movement as a movement that was really concentrated in the Deep South, that this is where the struggle was most intense against segregation. And while all of that may be true, one of the things that King did was to take the struggle to the North. Because now this was not simply a struggle against segregation and racism in the South, it was a struggle against racism in the entire country. It was a struggle against poverty, right? And again, they're very interesting tidbits because Branch, in just a paragraph or two, describes the palpable fear and tension in American cities. And there's a very interesting quotation from a reporter, from a columnist writing for the magazine The New Republic, who said, "No nation hates its own cities as much as does the United States. Only in the USA are suburbs afraid of their own parents." Right? End quote. And I think that this is what makes the book interesting, is all of these little tidbits here and there, including the definition that Martin Luther King offered of a slum, which I had not encountered before, and this is on page 135. So this is King giving a public address in Chicago on 7th February 1966, page 135. He says, "This economic exploitation is crystallized in the slum," which he goes on to define as an area where free trade and exchange of culture and resources is not allowed to exist. A system of internal colonialism, not unlike the exploitation of the Congo by Belgium. End quote. Right. Chapter 15 is about Black Power, about the rise of Stokely Carmichael. Of course, the prophet of that movement, so to speak, was the late Malcolm X, who at this point was already dead. He had been assassinated a little while earlier. And what Branch does in this chapter is to describe really briefly the relationship between Stokely Carmichael and King, who had rather different conceptions, different ideas about the nature of the struggle, but nonetheless were really in agreement about some fundamentals as well. Both of them, of course, understood very well the nature of racism, the nature of white supremacy, the dangers posed by the KKK, by the white citizens' councils, and both of them understood very well the role of the law in the suppression of black people as well. But as King spoke eloquently, right, and this is a speech that is cited on page 147. This is one of his responses, really, in a way, to Stokely Carmichael, and this is what he says, right? Because, they're having a kind of a debate, and it seemed to some that King was perhaps somewhat on the losing side, but he wins back the crowd with his sermon against violence. And I quote, "I am not going to allow anybody to pull me so low as to use the very methods that perpetuated evil throughout our civilization. I'm sick and tired of violence. I'm tired of the war in Vietnam. I'm tired of war and conflict in the world. I'm tired of shooting. I'm tired of hatred. I'm tired of selfishness. I'm tired of evil. I'm not going to use violence no matter who says it." Right? So this was really, I think, his response to Stokely Carmichael. And I don't think one could have given a better response. Towards the end, Branch moves to King's famous speech at the Riverside Church, where he describes his own government, the government of the United States of America, as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Right? And of course, when King gave that speech, he was criticized by many people in the movement who thought that, well, now this movement is going to be tainted because the movement is going to be seen as allying itself with communism, that King is critiquing American foreign policy in Vietnam, but he is implicitly therefore supporting the communists in Vietnam. Right? So King got a lot of flack for this particular speech, but I think that this is unquestionably the view of Taylor Branch, this was one of the most glorious moments in the short but brilliant life of Martin Luther King. And he gave the perfect response when people thought that he was undermining the civil rights movement, that he was really the public face-off in this country. And this is what he said, page 157. The war in Vietnam is a much graver injustice to Negroes than anything I could say against the war. End quote. And that brings us to the final chapter, final two chapters, so 1967-68, late 1967, moving into early 1968. The crusade against poverty becomes even critically more important for Martin Luther King. Now, we know that he's thinking about the category of class. We understand that he's gone beyond only the question of race, while, of course, he's also very much aware of the particular ways in which race and class intersected in the life of black people. Right? But he has larger questions and concerns in his mind at this point. And of course, it was at the instance of Reverend James Lawson, who now comes back into the picture, right, that King goes to Memphis in 1968, where Lawson was leading a strike by sanitation workers who were being treated abysmally by the city of Memphis, by the state. Right? So he goes there. King goes there because Lawson said, I want you to come there, and your presence here will be an enormous boost to this movement. And it is in Memphis that Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. And it is practically with this that the book ends. I mean, there are a few pages of an afterword of sorts, but this is practically where the book ends. This is a book very much worth reading, even for those who are really familiar with the civil rights movement, partly because he really, in these 18 chapters, takes what you might describe as either 18 key moments or 18, and of course one could have added 5 or 10 more, perhaps, but keeping it within something like 200 pages, he takes these moments, these figures, and gives us a broad history in elegant prose of the civil rights movement, while suggesting the particular manner in which this struggle, even as it belonged to black people as a whole, and even as it was authored by many, such as John Lewis, James Lawson, Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, Andy Young, Charles Shuttlesworth, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks. Nonetheless, even as it belonged to the black people and was authored by all of these, this movement became indelibly associated with Martin Luther King. And thus, this is a book about America in the King years. Thank you.